there's a story in anything. It doesn't matter if we're talking to accountants or to AI engineers or rocket scientists. There's something interesting in everything. And the root to that is emotion. We're really interested in not just how many people download this episode, but of the people that did, how much of this episode did they listen to?
Welcome to an extra special episode of Smarter Podcasting with me, your host, Neil Mackay. I started my first podcast in 2019 as a hobby, just for some fun, with a terrible microphone in my front room, and I just wanted to share the stories of people who lived in Vietnam. That podcast amazingly took off and it absolutely changed my life. And I ended up starting 7 Million Bikes podcast, which pales in comparison to who I'm going to be talking to today. But we have produced over 700 episodes. We worked with over 50 clients and we've helped several of them get to the top of the Apple podcast charts. And when I'm about to tell you who I'm speaking to today, that sounds absolutely terrible, but I'm still very proud of it. We now created this show, Smarter Podcasting, to help share with you tips and tricks from myself and from experts around the world on how to make the best show possible. Now, today we have a very, very special guest. In this episode, I'm going to be discussing why brands should move away from the dreaded two people talking format, which I personally am pretty sick of, even though I'm doing it right now. It is what everybody does. It's what most podcasts do. You have a host and a guest and they talk to each other. But this man is changing that to create narrative rich experiences that not only build brand credibility, it will help grow your audience and connect you to qualified leads, which is what we want to do here at 7 Million Bikes podcast as well, is help you grow your business. So I am really excited to talk to my guest today, who is the founder of Lower Street Media, a business that we look up to immensely. They're a podcast production agency who, and this is where it makes us pale in comparison, they have produced over 7,000 episodes, 100 shows, and they have over 12 million downloads. And they have clients including PepsiCo, Booking.com, and Fidelity, to name just a few. My guest today is the one and only Harry Morton, the founder of Lower Street Media. Thank you for joining us on Smarter Podcasting today.
Thank you very much. That's far too much praise for an internet nerd to be able to handle. But I'll just move. Let's move on. Thank you.
What you've done is incredible. So tell us a little bit about how a self-proclaimed internet nerd like yourself has created one of the biggest and best podcast agencies in the world.
Well, I mean, we've been working at it for 8 years. It's been a long and slow kind of process of working on cooler and cooler projects with bigger and bigger brands, and also, to your point around kind of how do we encourage folks to move away from that interview format, or to consider moving away from that interview format. It's been about sort of incrementally, working on each podcast is like, oh, look what those guys over there did, and now check out this brand and what they did, and then sort of in each time encouraging everyone to be just a little bit braver, to go outside their comfort zone a little bit more and do more and more interesting formats of shows. So it's very hard to wake up one morning and convince like an international bank to do something that's outside of the norm. They're pretty risk-averse organizations. So it's definitely an iterative thing. So that's really our story all over. Is just a long and hardworking iteration, I suppose.
So how did you start in podcasting?
So my background is in music and audio post-production. So I went to university for music production, and then I went into a post-production studio in Soho in London, where we did sort of sound for TV adverts. And I was a super bottom of the pecking order engineer's assistant. And I worked there for a couple of years, and it was fairly miserable. It was incredibly intense. You were the first one in and the last one out. And it was just a lot of work working for ad agencies. I wish I could blame someone else, but I lost some recordings for, believe it or not, a Domestos advert. So for any international listeners, a bleach brand in the UK, they did a voice recording episode. There was this episode of this particular advert where there were these bacteria inside the toilet, and they were like these gangsters, and they were like, and you had to kind of, they poured the Domestos on, and they were vanquished. But I lost the voice recordings of a voiceover session, and that was sort of the nail in the coffin for me, and I got fired. So I lost my job there, and it was after that I then kind of went into sales and marketing. And it turned out I was quite good at that. So I did sales and marketing for a few years, and that allowed me to travel. And I sort of left audio behind for a while. But then through the sort of early teens, I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and I knew I wanted to start my own business. Didn't know what that was going to be, but I was educating myself on. I'm not much of a reader. I'm more of a listener. I prefer to kind of learn that way. So I was listening to a ton of podcasts on how to start a business and what kind of business to start. And it sort of slowly dawned on me that, hey, actually, podcasting is this growing industry. And that was around sort of 2015, 16. I have some experience, I have some knowledge of how audio works. I've got the sales and marketing side that I can hopefully build a client base with. And so I sort of combined those two skill sets. And that was in the end of 2016. I launched Lower Street. And it was very much me in my underpants in my bedroom saying we and trying to sound like a legitimate outfit. And slowly through kind of working on bigger and better shows, we've kind of grown to where we are today. So
It's so encouraging to hear your story because it is actually really similar to mine as well. And I mentioned to you, we look up to you so much, and my plan is to be where you guys are within the next 5 years, and hopefully we're on the same path. And my background is not in sound engineering, and I'm one of these people that have benefited from the massive leap in AI technology, and so I can do things now with sound that I would never have been able to do even like 5 years ago. But now I can do things at the touch of a button and make things sound so good, which is really exciting. How did you lose the files, by the way? Like what? Like
that's not a very interesting story. There was just like a database in the studio, and I had to like update the database every day, and I didn't update the database one day, and then the files were lost, and it was my fault. So yeah.
I've just had one. It's not really been a big deal, but one of the clients we work with wanted like the old files. Like we've been working with him for over a year, and he wanted like these old files. And I was like, oh, like I've cleared the hard drive because like we didn't have it written down how long I would keep stuff for, and I didn't think he would need them. Like, so I still have like the last 4 months left, but we've been working together for like a year, and he wants these videos, and I was like, you're gonna have to download them from YouTube because like I never imagined that you were gonna ask for these 12 months later. And he doesn't seem annoyed about it. It's because it was not ever something we talked about, but it's been a good learning thing. I was like, we should make sure we have this in writing, how long I
Definitely, yeah.
keep stuff because I need to clear the hard drive. Anyway, my background was in a little bit of sales as well, and so then similar. I was like, I really love podcasts. And I had actually, my wife and I had been talking for quite a while about starting our own business. We wanted to do something. We really liked the appeal of it. But it was always one of those things where we're like, but in what? We don't really have anything that we're like super passionate about that we're like, let's turn this into a business. But then podcasting became my passion and was able to become my business, which was really exciting. So going into this two-person narrative, I'm really, really excited to hear more about this because even just as we're talking, my brain is firing off thinking about I recorded an episode today with a pharmaceutical marketing company. I did one with a foreign direct investment company last week, and it's all two or three. Today was like a three-person interview. But I'm already thinking like, how would we change that? But in my mind, I'm like, how do you do that? Because how do you suddenly make a story out of accounting, for example, or something like that? So explain to me how you did that basically, and what is the concept?
Yeah. So, first, I guess I want to just very briefly defend the interview format show. Like, I'm not here to say shows suck. We're on one right now, and hopefully there are some people out there that are listening and enjoying it. I think there's absolutely a place for that kind of show. I think the reason that there's two reasons. There's partly just my personal interest. I prefer to listen to shows like Serial is what got us, so many of us, excited about podcasting back in the day, and those and all of the BBC shows that they produce, and NPR, all these incredible kind of old school radio storytelling, like proper documentary making and storytelling, is what really excites me. And I think there's a huge opportunity to do that. And I didn't see enough of that in podcasting, and certainly not in the branded podcasting space. So that's why I've been really passionate about wanting to do it. But the other reason is one of differentiation. I think like I said, there's nothing wrong with an interview format show. And in many areas, that's absolutely what the audience wants and what the audience needs. And so we need to think carefully around, like, what are we actually trying to achieve? What's the audience we're trying to serve? What do they need? And how do we make the best show for them? And if the answer is an interview format show, then great. That's awesome. However, we're now in a situation where instead of there being 400,000 podcasts, there's 4 million. And so that while that pales in comparison to what we see on YouTube and in the blog format and so on, like there's still a long way to go in podcasting, but nevertheless, the listener has choice. There's no shortage of options of things to listen to on basically any topic you could choose to mention. So, how do we as a new podcaster stand any chance of competing with a podcast that's been around for 5 years and has 300 episodes? How are we going to stand apart from them? Well, I think the answer is thinking about differentiating through the content. And that might, so and for us, that's sort of the formatting. And so that might be through creating, we work with clients where we make a fully fictionalized story. So we're using voice actors and creating sound worlds in sound, soundscapes and sound design, all this kind of stuff. It might be that, like, I don't think enough brands are making quiz shows. Like, there's no quiz shows produced by brands. I would listen to a quiz show. I think they're fun and entertaining. Like, they've been around for ages and they're really popular, but you don't really see them in podcasting. You know, anyway, I could list a bunch of formats and we can get to that later maybe. But I guess what I'm saying is there's lots of ways that we can think about presenting the same information in a way that's slightly more engaging and more interesting and more novel. And as such, will kind of is likely more to garner more attention from the people that you're competing for the attention of. But to your point, I think there's a story in anything. It doesn't matter if we're talking to accountants or to AI engineers or rocket scientists. There's something interesting in everything, and the root to that is emotion, right? Like we are as humans, we're pre-programmed to be drawn to kind of emotional stories that tap into some part of our being, whether it's humor and comedy, whether it's fear, whether it's sadness or happiness or intrigue. There's so many of these things that we can tap into in storytelling, and it doesn't matter if the person we're interviewing is sort of an Excel junkie typing in numbers into a spreadsheet. There's something that's happened to them in the process of doing that work that is interesting. And so I think the job of the storyteller is to find those angles and present them in the right way. And so, for example, if we compare, what are the two options? So we might have like the marketing expert podcast that probably exists, but let's pretend it doesn't for a moment. The marketing expert podcast. Today we've got a guest who's going to tell us all about how to grow our audience on LinkedIn. We have a couple options there. We can either say, okay, I'm going to sit down for 45 minutes and interview this person, and they're going to tell us about the strategies for how they grow their channel on LinkedIn. Great, that's useful, but it doesn't really stand out. And there's about 100 other podcasts doing exactly the same thing. But we could instead interview that same creator on LinkedIn and say, tell me about the time that you, I don't know, I'm just making this up, but tell me about the time you first created something that went totally viral, and like, what did that feel like? Like, what was that experience like? And who did you get comments from? And did you get trolled? And what did you do next? How did you follow up from that? Did it get inside your head? Did you overthink things? There's all these angles on the same story. We're still conveying the same information, but instead of being it just fact based of A, B, C, I did this and then I did this and then I did this, and here's how you can replicate it. It's like, how did that make you feel? And what did that mean to you? And what did it mean to your business and all that kind of stuff? And those are the things that I think are really, really interesting and compelling.
My brain right now is just firing off in a million different directions. And that's really, really exciting. I mean, literally, as you're talking, I'm thinking of some of the podcast clients that we work with. And I'm like, how could we? That's just amazing. How could we turn that into a narrative? And that's one big thing before we started speaking. I was like, how would you do that? But then, exactly like you said, you could have the same discussion, but you add that emotion to it. It's also really interesting what you're saying. Quiz show podcast, love it. So I actually host a weekly quiz here in Saigon every Tuesday night. I've been doing this for years now, and that's an amazing idea. So now I might steal that idea and then turn it into a podcast. That would be great. The other thing I really wanted to do, so I went through a spell a few months ago, or maybe a year ago, of just binging fiction podcasts. So I absolutely love fiction podcasts. So this Homecoming was for me one of the best, if you've heard that, which then became an Amazon show. There is Case File, and I always forget the number, 43 or 88. It's called Case File something, and it's got Julianne Moore and Oscar Isaac, and the guys come back from the future. It's almost very Terminator. The storyline is almost straight out of the Terminator, but comes back from the future, has to save humanity in the future is basically the storyline. But amazing actors in it, and each episode is like, I think 8 minutes long or like 15 minutes long. It's super short. So I was going through this spell of just binging them, like Blackout as well with Rami Malek, and I don't know if I said his name right. Is that how you say his name? The guy that played Freddie Mercury?
I'm terrible with names, so yeah, pass.
That guy.
I would be very bad in your quiz team, I can tell you. So don't you don't want me there.
So I got the idea. I was like, I really want to make like a fictional podcast, and I actually talked to a couple of actor friends here, and was like, and we had a meeting, and I was like, we kind of came up with the basis of the show, and I was like, I want to produce it. You guys are the creative ones. You can write it, make it, and then just unfortunately, we weren't getting paid for it, making any money for it. It was a passion project, and everyone got busy, and it just never really happened. But it's still sitting there in the back of my mind. If I could just grab a few people, and because I probably could. I mean, I could write something. Everybody can write something, but I just don't have the time is a problem. And so that I think those podcasts, like exactly like you're saying, are creative and have a narrative and emotion. People absolutely love that stuff. But you run an agency that is focused on working with brands, and that's where we want to get to as well. And really interesting what you're saying, like brands like banks are obviously very risk averse and they want to do the standard format. So how do you pitch to them? How do you persuade them? And how do you come up with a moving out? How do you move away from the 2-person or 3-person narrative podcast to work with a brand and get them to buy into that?
Yeah, I think it really is a conversation around what are the goals? Like, what are you why are you doing podcasting, and what are you trying to get out of it? And I think often, particularly with the larger brands, the goals are less about how do we generate more leads this week, right? So if you're, I don't know, like name drop any bank here, like let's say you're Chase, you know, what you don't really care about when you're putting out content into the world is like 20 people signing up for a bank account tomorrow. Like that's not really the goal. It's the goal is much more around branding. It's around positioning your brand and getting people to care about it and feel about it in a certain way, and have it in their mind so that when the time comes that they want to do business in some way, you're the name that they kind of reach for. So the goal is less about how do we communicate a bunch of products and services in an interesting way, or how do we kind of like veil our sales pitch in some kind of like thing. Quite often the conversation is more around how do we just earn the attention of the people that matter to us as a business? And the answer to that is, well, you make a piece of entertainment. You don't make a piece of really dry thought leadership. And I mean, by the way, we produce lots of thought leadership content and it can be wonderful and it can be creative and interesting. We talked about how you can turn an interview show into something that's more compelling, but I'm talking about the sort of like, if we go to the far end of what's really exciting about working with some of these bigger brands, I think that's kind of what's important to them is spending time, having the audience that they're looking to serve hang out with their brand on a regular basis. So, for example, we talked about audio fiction. GE had the podcast The Message, which I think they ran for 1 or 2 seasons. Hugely successful, completely fictionalized show, and I might be mixing up the brand and the podcast, so forgive me because it was a while ago. But anyway, it was amazing. It was hugely, hugely successful. It had absolutely nothing to do with the brand or the product. It was a fictional drama. There was literally zero connection between the show and the product. But what they were doing was just sponsoring or effectively sponsoring. They were creating, but they were effectively sponsoring something that they thought would be popular and stand out. And sure enough, it was, and it was incredibly effective for them. So I guess we can, if we're wanting to be really brave, and we're one of these larger brands where branding is really more the kind of goal here, then we can think slightly more creatively. And so that's how we sort of communicate that to brands. Like if you actually want to earn the attention of these people, we've got to create something. We're competing for their attention with, I don't know, the Joe Rogan Experience and the BBC and NPR and This American Life. And, we're up against all of the best podcasts in the world there. So in that case, we've got to think about what's actually worth their time. And sometimes that still involves talking about the subject. So again, if we're a bank, it might be talking about investing. It might be still around that subject, but delivering that in a way that's more than just facts that they could Google. Yeah, and then again, the final thing I would say is also it's about comparison. It's about having examples to give. And so if you're able to say, "Look, Chase, we've never worked with Chase, so look, Chase, look what you could, look at what these brands are doing over here, and how marvelously successful they were. That's what you could do as well." And so I think a lot of the time it's about that sort of showing people that it's okay, like you can do it and it's safe and it works and it's cool. That's an important piece of it as well.
But do you find, right? I can imagine as soon as you go into one of these meetings, what everybody wants is an ROI, right? They want a return on their investment. They're like, well, because you said, oh, they might not want 20 new bank accounts, but often that might be what they want. And how do you get through that if you do work with a client? Because I've worked with them with the first question is, how many people are going to listen to this? How many people are going to see it? How many people are going to click the link? And you're like, this is more about like brand awareness, top of funnel marketing. You're not really going to turn these people directly into clients. And we mentioned as well in the beginning, you've helped so many brands get to our podcast, get to the top of the Apple podcast charts, and we've been able to help a few as well. But just recently, I was talking with one of the owners of that podcast, and I was, saying, we've helped you get in the top 10 of the Apple podcast charts. And he was like, I don't care about that. He's like, I don't care if we're number one. I just want to talk to people, that I want to network with people. And it was my fault that I didn't understand. To be honest, his goal had changed, and I hadn't been made aware that the goal had changed. But everybody has a different goal for their podcast. So how do you work around that, or you just have a conversation and find that out before?
Yeah, for sure. So it's important to establish those. But I think so it might be helpful if I kind of move the conversation away from like international, large, huge organizations and more to that sort of a lot of the brands that we work with uh, are big organizations, but maybe not at that scale, and so therefore their goals are slightly different, and so they do question ROI. They wonder like, what does ROI look like? And you're right, a lot of the conversation is around, okay, how many downloads can we expect? And the follow up question to that is like, well, why is that a metric that's important to you? Like, what is it about that you're, and often the answer is, well, we're looking for brand awareness and reach and like all this kind of stuff. And the conversation that we typically have is around that it's not that the download is not an interesting, not a metric that's worth anything at all, but it's by far the least interesting one in terms of how you get value from your podcast, but also how you understand the value of podcasting versus other media. So the thing that we try to focus attention on is actually listen time. And so we're really interested in not just how many people download this episode, but of the people that did, how much of this episode did they listen to? That's something that's incredibly powerful about podcasting. It's very, very common to have 80+% completion rates of a 30 or 40-minute piece of content on a weekly basis. That's a lot of attention. If we compare that to a video on YouTube, you might get 5-10% if you're lucky consumption rate.
This is what I tell people when I'm like, what's the difference between YouTube and podcast? I'm like, YouTube, you get 5% maybe. And
Exactly.
even YouTube tells you, when you look at the metrics, that if 50% of your viewers are still watching after 30 seconds, you're doing well. And you're like, oh
Exactly.
my goodness. So you're
Exactly. Whereas
expected to lose.
podcasting smashes that. So I think that the thing that's so what we have the power there to do is actually impact we might reach 1,000 people instead of 1,000,000, right? But of the people we reach, because the content is so niche and because they actually care enough to stick around and listen to it, the impact that that's going to have is significantly higher, right? And that's not to say you should do podcasting, you shouldn't do YouTube. It's to say that's what its value is. If we think about the big marketing pie, that's the slice, that's the job, that's the layer of the cake, I don't know, that podcasting serves. It is the deep level of engagement that you get with people. So that's what we talk about a lot in terms of ROI is what is the impact that this content is having on the people that you're reaching? And that can be hugely valuable. But to your point, like interestingly, Ashley Carmen just put out a piece on Bloomberg today that we were lucky to be quoted in, which was about brands that are, and this tends for in our experience anyway, this tends to be really good for sort of early stage startups and also agencies and digital brands and things like this. They're using podcasting as an account-based marketing tool. So just like the customer of yours that you just mentioned, they're not looking at it to how do I grow a massive audience and then hopefully we'll generate leads based off people listening to the podcast and kind of phoning in. Instead, it's how do we use the podcast as a platform to spend time with ideal fit clients for us. So I want to work with this brand over here. We have no way through the door. I could email them my sales deck, but let's face it, they're going to not look at that and they're going to ignore it. And they're probably going to think I'm an idiot for having done it. Whereas if I was to email that person and say, hey, we would love to interview your CEO or your CMO or whatever to come onto our podcast as a guest, our audience would find that super valuable and we'd love to spend time. You then get an hour in the room with this person. That's incredibly valuable and it can turn into business much more effectively than sort of growing an audience. And so then what you're creating then is a networking channel that also happens to generate an audience and has all the benefits that brings. And you're generating a bunch of content you can reuse on social media and all this sort of stuff. So there are a bunch of different ways that brands think about ROI in podcasting. So it's really about understanding what's important to you. Why are you doing podcasting? Should you be doing podcasting is an important question. And if we decide that, yes, it is right, and these are the reasons, then we can kind of tailor the podcast to fulfill those needs, I guess.
What you've just said there is probably the biggest nugget of wisdom and the most value that anyone will get in this episode. And
Great. Well, I'm off
it
then. So.
is see ya. It's around that fact that inviting people that you want to do business with on your podcast is one of the most valuable things. And it's something that I advise my clients to do as well. And when you're trying to talk about ROI and you're like, I'll be like, this is like the secret sauce. This is not what many people will tell you, but don't worry about how many people are going to listen. But if you can, exactly like you said, and so it's really, really interesting. This podcast, Smarter Podcasting, I first started this to sell my podcast course because I had a podcast course which doesn't exist anymore. I don't even know where it lives anymore, but it was didn't I think I sold like 4 of them. It took hours and hours and hours and hours to make, and I sold 4. But it was a great experience. And part of that starting Smarter Podcasting was about helping people to make the great podcast and then ultimately hopefully create business. But now the strategy has completely changed. The reason I do Smarter Podcasting mostly is to talk to people like yourself. I want to network within the industry. And within the last like 2 months, I've spoken obviously now to yourself. Jordan Harbinger has millions of downloads, would never have imagined talking to him. Ariel Nissenblatt from Descript. Sam Sethi, who's just started True Fans and is a massive podcasting 2.0. Spoke to Adam Shively, who I just listened to everything he says and copy everything he does. And it was great when I interviewed him because he's like, yeah, that's fine because I copied all of this from somebody else as well. Like nobody does anything original, right? And so for me, this podcast is now about giving value to you that's listening right now so you can make the best podcast possible. But from a personal side, for me, it's being able to talk to incredible people in the industry that, just like you said, there probably wouldn't be much of a reason. Or if I said to you, hey, Harry, nice to meet you on LinkedIn, do you want to have a call for an hour? You'd probably be like, I am a bit busy. I mean, I would do the exact same as well. But we all have egos. And when somebody says, hey, you want to be on my podcast? Like 99 times out of 100, that person's going to be like, yeah, of course I'll be on your podcast. No problem.
Yeah, it's an amazing hack, and yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't want to go down a tangent, but just to very briefly say, I think like if I went back into being a salesperson, I would 100% start a podcast today. I think it would be, it doesn't matter what I'm selling. Just using this as a platform to get in front of people, I think is hugely powerful. That wouldn't necessarily be to the betterment of podcasting as a content platform, because I think a lot of salespeople would make pretty poor podcasts, but it would still serve that purpose from a sales perspective. So yeah, I think it's a really great tool.
Do you think, though, that people like yourself and me are being incredibly cynical towards podcasting? Because podcasting as a medium, I love it. It's an independent, driven initially by independent podcasters. I started and still am an independent podcaster. And then people like me and you are like, no, we want to work with the biggest brands. And I'm not gonna lie, I want to do it because they pay the most money, right? Like you can't really make a living, or it's more difficult to make a living just doing small podcasts. Are we cynical? Are we terrible people for wanting to make money out of podcasting and wanting to work with big brands?
No. So yes. No, no, so when I was first hiring for Lower Street and finding people that wanted to come over and work, this was in 2000 sort of 17, 18, 19. And so, I mean, it wasn't early really, but it didn't feel early at the time. But looking back now, I think we're still very much in the early stages of podcasting as a medium. So it was pretty early, I think. And back then, I would speak to lots of journalists who had great experience from, wherever. Um, but they were sort of turned off the idea of branded podcasting because it didn't, to them, and fair enough, it didn't feel like it had that same level of sort of journalistic integrity. I think was a lot of the sort of feeling that sort of went behind it, and they want to sort of tell stories for story's sake. And but my goal has always been to do cool work. Like I just want to make cool stuff. And how do you do that? Well, you need it to be paid for, and I can't, especially when I started this business, I'm not able to sort of pay to do cool, big audio fictional dramas. Can't do it. It's just that's a really, really big and expensive thing to do. So it's got to be paid for by someone. And I think if we sort of take that journalistic route, you're either paid by the media outlet, so the BBC or the Guardian or whatever, or you're paid by sponsors who sponsor that content on the back end. That's effectively your paycheck. Kind of the same thing if you ask me. And with brand content, what you have there is just a very clear source of funding that allows you to do really great work. And I'm really comfortable with that trade because it has to get paid by paid for somewhere. Audiences, time and again, there's been many surveys that show that people actually are appreciative towards the brands that create shows. They're glad that this content can be afforded. They understand that it costs money to make good stuff, and that they're glad for the brands that are willing to pay to make that happen. They don't care whether they're advertisers or whether they're the brands that bring them the shows entirely. So to me, initially it was a means to an end of like, well, we want to make cool stuff. So how do we do that? Well, brands are the ones that need it. So let's work with them and encourage them to make really great shows. But also, I came from the sales and marketing industry. My job was to help brands market themselves. So I knew that already, and it's only come to be more and more true. Is that it's also really great. There's a lot of these brands have really interesting audiences, and they're on really interesting missions to do cool things. And the shows that we produce allow them to do that, and they allow them to tell really cool stories around the stuff. So it's not just like I needed to find a source of funding, and that allows me to make podcasts. It's also like the podcasts are serving a genuinely good purpose. They're serving an audience. They're doing really cool stuff. So I'm really passionate about it. I understand that's not necessarily for everyone, although I think that now since 2017, 18, I imagine a lot of those journalists are actually a lot more comfortable with that idea than perhaps they were originally. But I still totally respect and understand that thing. But anyway, I think we're in a good industry doing good work and helping people tell interesting stories. So I'm comfortable with it. But I don't know. We'll see what happens when I get to the pearly gates.
No, I mean, 100% agree. And that question comes from, I have this part of my brain that always thinks about the worst of social media, that there's going to be that person that leaves that comment that's going to be like something that challenges you, or like, no, I don't agree with this. I think that. So I don't actually think it myself, but that's kind of where that question comes from. And the beauty of podcasting is that it does have a low barrier to entry, and anyone with a microphone can do it. And anyone with a microphone can make a super successful show. I know my wife absolutely loves Sounds Like a Cult, which I got into as well a little bit. I don't know if you know that one. That was like two friends. One of them had written a book about cults, and the other one was a stand-up comedian. And then during the lockdown, during COVID, they started a podcast about basically like, it sounds like a cult? Is it a cult? So a bit things like Starbucks or Apple, or like completely like innocuous things, not like actual cults. And and they went on to get millions of downloads and became massively famous. And that just started with two people in the front room with a microphone. And I mentioned like my dad wrote a porno. That was just three university friends met in the kitchen. And so that the fact that that can exist, and there's not many other mediums where you can just go buy £100, $100 microphone, and within a few months or a few years, however long, be super famous and doing amazing things. So keep up the good work. It's incredible what you're doing. As I say, I'm looking over your shoulder. I'm looking at what you're doing. You guys are the bellwether. Is that the right phrase? What do you? I don't know the phrase. I'm terrible with my phrases and things like
Well,
that.
that's
But
really kind of you, Neil. Thank you. Yeah.
no, you're very, very welcome. So we're coming for you. We'll be about 5 years' time, and then you'll be 5 years ahead still anyway. So, but well done with everything you're doing. Congratulations. Recently, you just took over or bought the Pacific Content brand as well, which is really exciting. And keep up all the good work. So thank you very much, Harry Morton, for coming on Smarter Podcasting. Thank you to you for listening. Don't forget, of course, turn on notifications, subscribe, follow, do all of that good stuff. Leave a review as well. That would be super helpful. And best of all, if you can, if you know anyone else who makes a podcast and you think that this episode or any episode would be helpful to them, then please share this episode with them so they can get that good value as well. So thank you very much, Harry. Thank you to you for listening, and cheers.